Welcome to Mint. I'm Kirti Rao. In this edition of From the Newsroom, we are joined by Rahul Chandran from Bangalore. Welcome to the show, Rahul.
Thanks, Kirti.
We are here to discuss the Dedicated Freight Corridor Corporation, which has pointed out that the concession agreement being signed with the railways will not allow it to deal with private parties. So, Rahul, what really is the issue here and what is the contention between the DFC and the railways?
Kirti, the central issue, it isn't, there are sections within the railways who feel that the DFC ought to be allowed to be at arm's length from the railways, which means that they ought to be allowed to enter they ought to be able to speak to potential customers by themselves. They ought to be able to hit the equity markets by themselves, that sort of thing. There's another section which feels that they ought to be a in-house construction arm of the railways, which means that their job is only to build the dedicated freight corridor network and nothing else. And the story kind of talks about that kind of difference of opinion about what exactly the DFC is.
What are DFCs and why do we need to have dedicated freight lanes?
So the DFC is basically a network of track that is solely meant for freight trains, which are meant to run freight trains between two corridors of the country, the eastern and the western corridor.
Right.
Why we need them is because currently, in the current system, what's happening is the same sets of tracks are being used for both the freight trains and the passenger trains. So the end result, of course, is heavy congestion, and you can't run too many freight trains, that kind of thing.
Right.
So the dedicated freight corridors are the corridor is meant basically to ease congestion and have separate tracks for freight trains so you can run more freight trains.
So Rahul, could you tell us why is this confusion between the DFC and the railways important?
So there's a basic confusion whether they ought to look at the freight corridor as, the company building the freight corridors as kind of solely a construction company, or do you go ahead and think of them as an operator and return equity to the main stakeholder, which is basically the Indian Railways. So it's basically how do you in effect the freight traffic subsidizes passenger traffic even today. Now the question is, do you continue doing it the way the railways always been doing it, which is allow them to collect revenues from both freight and passenger and them to offset passenger costs by freight, or do you allow a company that to do this and their revenues ultimately flow into the President of India through the Indian Railways?
Thank you for your insights, Rahul. That's all for today. Thank you for watching and stay tuned for more.